Welcome everyone to quarter 2 of the school year. We're going to start this quarter looking at percentages, and we're going to take what we learned last quarter about ratios and proportions, and we're going to apply those further into percents. And percents are some things that you're going to see them everywhere in the world. You see them in school, you see them when you're shopping, you see them in sports all the time. So basically everywhere you go, you can't escape percents. So let's learn a little bit about percents. We're going to start with just conversions. So when we're converting percents to decimals, you just have to move the decimal point backwards by 2 spaces. So the first example shows 67, and you might say, well, hey, I don't see a decimal point. Pretend that says 67, it's like a 0.0. We don't show the 0.0 because we don't need to, but pretend there's a decimal point there. So if we move the decimal point 2 spots back, the decimal point would be there, so it would be 0.67. So 67% is the exact same thing as 0.67. And let's look at 30%. Again, you can think of 30% as having a decimal point after the 0 there. If we move the decimal over 2 spots, it becomes 0.30, and usually we don't write that last 0. I would just write it as 0.3. So when you see 0.3, it would mean 30%. Now we do see a decimal point, so this one actually makes it a little bit easier. 99.5%. I bet you'd be happy if that was your grade. We're just going to move that decimal point 2 spots back, and it becomes 0.995. Those are equivalent to each other. 99.5% and 0.995. Now we go to 8%. This is where it gets a little bit tricky, so pay attention. 8%, you can think of that as 8 with a little 0.0 after it if you want. But we're going to move it 2 spots, so go over 1, over 2. There's your new decimal. Any of those blank spaces, you got to fill in with a 0. So 8% would actually be 0.08. So anything under a 10%, you're going to have that 0 out in front of it. So keep that in mind. And 3.6%, hey, we see a decimal there, that's fine. So we can just move it 1, 2 spots, so it's over here, fill it in with a 0. So 3.6% would be 0.036. So that's how you convert a percent back into a decimal. So go ahead and pause the video and try the next 5 on your own. When you're all done, come on back and we will go the other way. We're going to convert decimals into percents. All right, hopefully that didn't take you too long. Now we're just going to go the other way. We're going decimals to percents, and to do this, it's just the opposite process. You're just going to move the decimal point forward by 2 spaces. So if we see 0.39, we see the decimal point at that right after the 0. And to convert it to a percentage, we just move it over 1 spot, 2 spots, so it would become 39%. Remember, if it's 39.0, we don't need to write that 0.0. If we have 0.02, we're going to move that over 2 spots, and that would be 2%. So 0.02 represents 2%. We have 0.9. This one's another tricky one. If we take that decimal and move it 1, 2 spots, there's a new decimal. We have to fill that in with a 0 there. So it would become 90%. So 0.9 is 90%. And it kind of looks like above. Remember we did 30% is 0.3, way up in here. 30% is 0.3. 90% is 0.9. 80% is 0.8. 70% is 0.7. So those are ones that you want to get used to. And we see 0.077, move the decimal over 2 spots, and it's going to be 7.7%. And the last one, if we move it over 2 spots, it would be 116%. So go ahead and give this video another pause and take a couple seconds to try the next set of problems on your own. All right, and now we move on to fractions. We're going to convert fractions into percents. Think of fractions, one easier way to do this, think of it in terms of your grades. Let's just say for the first example that you got a 20 out of 22 on your first quiz or first test for a class. I bet most of you would be reasonably happy with a 20 out of 22 because that represents a pretty good score. So your percent is probably going to be pretty high for this one as far as the 0 to 100 scale. So think of it as like a quiz score. 20 out of 22, probably a pretty good percent. So in order to convert fractions into a percent, we first have to divide on a calculator. So we're going to take 20 and divide it by 22. So we just go on a calculator, 20 divided by 22, and that gives us 0.9090, repeating. So that's the decimal equivalent, but now we have to turn it into a percent. And remember to turn a decimal into a percent. All we have to do is move that decimal spot 2 places. And so that becomes 90.9%. We're going to round things to 1 decimal point here. So 1 number after the decimal if needed. So I bet if most of you got a 90 or 91% on the test, you'd be pretty happy with it. 20 out of 22 is a pretty good score. Now we have 30 divided by 50. So if you got 30 out of 50 on a test, you probably wouldn't be quite as happy with it, at least not as happy as the other one before. And we want to convert this into a percentage. So we can take 30 divided by 50, and you're going to get 0.6. So equals 0.6. Now from above, we should know that 0.6, if we convert that back into a percent, move it over 2 spots, would become 60%. Now before we move on, I want to use this problem as kind of an example of showing you what a percent is actually doing. So a percent, it's just setting up a proportion where instead of being out of 50, it's always going to be out of 100. A percent is something always out of 100. Does that look familiar to you? So we're taking 30 out of 50. We're just scaling it up a little bit bigger. So now it's out of 100. So you can look at it as a proportion. We can use kind of the common sense way that we used last unit. To get from 50 to 100, you times it by 2. And to get from 30 to x, we have to again times that by 2. And then the x would be 60. So we'd end up getting 60% that way. So percent is really just setting up a proportion where the denominator is always 100. So percent just means out of 100. But sometimes it's not so easy to do that. Like when you get these big numbers with 2150, it's kind of tough to do that and scale it down to 100. That's why we just can divide them. So we're going to take 1800. We're going to divide it by 2150. And that's going to equal 0.837. And if you turn this into a percent, just scoot that decimal place over 2 spots, it's going to be 83.7%. And there's one more. Remember, if you're thinking of this as a quiz score, 3 out of 200 probably isn't going to be what you're shooting for. We're going to take 3 divided by 200. That's going to be a really, really small percent. It's going to be 0.015. And if we move that decimal point over 2 spots, it's going to be 1.5%. There's a couple of them for you to do on your own. Oh, and as far as that password that you're going to want. For the password, we're going to use, well, since I just got myself a new phone, we're going to use Apple. So your password, let's put it somewhere over here. Your password will be Apple for this assignment. So go ahead and try the next ones on your own. When you're all done, upload those answers into Schoology. Thanks, everyone. See you later.